All right, so again, just to kind of recap, the most important thing for finding which quadrant the values are in is remembering the cosine is the x value, the sine is the y value. Tangent, of course, is sine over cosine, so y over x. And then the 6 trig functions in order: sine, cosine, tangent, cotangent, secant, and cosecant. Okay, so let's determine the quadrant. All right, so for example, if we were given the information that we knew if the sine of x is greater than 0, so the sign is positive, okay? Now that tells us something about where we're talking. Oh, I lost my share there. We back? There we go. All right, so that tells me something about what quadrants we're talking about. If the sign is bigger than 0, remember the sign is the y value, that has to be up here in either the first or second quadrant if the sign is larger than 0. If the cosine is less than 0, meaning the cosine is negative, so now we're looking for, whoops, the cosine of x is less than 0. We're looking for the quadrant where the sine is positive and the cosine is negative. So remembering that the sine is the y value, so the sine is positive in these two quadrants. The cosine is negative in these two quadrants. So if you're looking one that satisfies both of them, that would have to be in the second quadrant. So again, if we're trying to determine where the sine, if the sine of x is greater than 0 and the cosine of x is less than 0, then x is in quadrant 2. All right, any questions? All right, let's determine again the quadrant here for the next one, okay? So if we're given, if the, let's say the cosecant of x is greater than 0. Now remember the cosecant, that, according to these, goes with the sine. So if the cosecant is positive, that's another way of saying that the sine is positive. Okay, so if the cosecant is greater than 0, and let's say that the cosine is greater than 0, then x is in, trying to determine which quadrant. So cosecant, that goes with the sine. That means the sine is positive, so that's in quadrant 1 or 2. Cosine is positive, so that's in 1 or 4. So that means it has to be in quadrant 1. All right, we'll try one with a tangent. So let's say if the tangent of x is less than 0, so the tangent is negative. So the tangent is negative. I'm just going to just see then x is in which quadrant or quadrants. So if the tangent is negative, and the tangent is the sine over the cosine, that means one of them is negative and one of them is positive. So in the first quadrant, they're both positive. So the tangent is positive, and so is the cotangent for that matter. In the second quadrant, the cosine is negative because that's the x, and the sine is positive because that's the y. So therefore, the tangent is negative in the second quadrant. The tangent is positive in the third quadrant because both cosine and sine are negative, and a negative divided by negative is positive. And the tangent is negative in the fourth quadrant because the cosine is positive and the sine is negative. So where is the tangent less than 0 or negative? That's in quadrants 2 and 4. All right, so determining the quadrant by just given whether they're positive or negative. Now, it might also be written a different way. We could say it's just a little bit different, but if we said, let's say, if the sine of x is equal to the square root of 3, okay? Don't worry about what the number is, the square root of 3. That's just telling us that it's positive. So if the sine of x is equal to the square root of 3, and the cosine of x is negative, well, this information, meaning the y value is positive, that's in either 1 or 2. This information, the cosine is negative, that's in either 2 or 3. So which quadrant satisfies both of them? Then x is in quadrant 2. So if you're given a value, you're simply using that same information to see if that value is positive or negative. All right, anybody have any questions before we break out into rooms?
I don't really understand how you did the tangent one.
Tangent, sure. The tangent is the sine over the cosine, okay? So if the sine, let's go back to our unit circle here, okay? In this second quadrant, the sine, which is the y value, would be positive, and the cosine, which is the x value, would be negative. And if you take a positive divided by a negative, you get a negative. Therefore, the tangent in the second quadrant is always going to be negative, because the sine will always be positive and the cosine will always be negative. That same thing, or similar, happens down in the fourth quadrant, because in the fourth quadrant, the sine is negative and the cosine is positive. So we have the sine is negative over cosine, which is positive. We have negative over a positive. So the tangent is always negative in the fourth quadrant as well. So you can remember that the tangent is negative in the second and fourth quadrants. The tangent is also positive in the first and third quadrants. And the reason the tangent is positive in the first quadrant is because you have a positive divided by a positive. As opposed to in the third quadrant, the tangent is also positive because you have a negative divided by a negative. Okay, so good question. Are there any other questions? All right, so now we are going to find the trig value. So we're going to be finding the value, and I'm going to do a few examples here. Let's say we want to find the sine of pi over 6. All right, first thing we would want to determine is what quadrant are we in? So we are in the first quadrant. Our reference angle is pi over 6 because that is in the first quadrant. So if I had these 3 reference angles memorized, which you guys really should be doing over the next couple of days or maybe a week, and I know that at pi over 6, my x value is root 3 over 2, and my y value is 1/2. That means the sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. So the sine of pi over 6 is equal to 1/2. All right, now along with that, or a problem that might be related to it, let's say we wanted to find the cosine of 5 pi over 6. All right, well, first I want to determine what quadrants am I in. 5 pi over 6 is going to be in the second quadrant because it's almost 6 over 6. Okay, my reference angle is pi over 6. My cosine is the x value. So putting that together, I'm in the second quadrant. The x value is negative in the second quadrant, and my reference angle is pi over 6. So again, if I go and I have these first quadrant values, okay, if I have those memorized, in fact, I'm just going to copy and paste them down here. Now, of course, you guys should memorize those, as I said. But that was my pi over 6. Those are my x and y value. Cosine of 5 pi over 6 is going to be this guy, root 3 over 2. But don't forget, we are in the second quadrant. So it's going to be negative root 3 over 2. All right, if we wanted to find the tangent of 11 pi over 6, fourth quadrant, because it's almost 12 over 6. I'm going to move this because I might need a little more work on it. Tangent is sine over cosine. So I'm looking at pi over 6. It's the sine, which is 1/2, over the cosine, which is root 3 over 2. But remember, in the fourth quadrant, the 1/2 is going to be negative. So it will be negative 1/2 over root 3 over 2. All right, I now need to simplify that though. So my 2's will cancel out there because if I took the bottom and flipped it over. So I would have negative 1 over the square root of 3. But we are, of course, going to have to rationalize that. So we multiply top and bottom by root 3 over root 3. So our final answer is negative root 3 over 3. All right, I'm going to do a couple more. If we had the cosine of x, I'm sorry, let's say cosine of pi over 4, we want to know what that equals. This is x value at pi over 4. So looking on my unit circle at pi over 4, the x value is root 2 over 2. So if I wanted to find, let's say, the sine of 5 pi over 4, related problem. because pi over 4 is my reference angle. So I know the root 2 over 2, because that's both the x and y value, is going to have something to do with it. But 5 pi over 4 is in the third quadrant. The sign is the y value. So in the third quadrant, the y value is negative root 2 over 2. Okay, again, y value is going to be negative down in the third quadrant. So if I wanted to find the tangent of 7 pi over 4, well, tangent is sine over cosine. 7 pi over 4 is in the fourth quadrant because it's almost 2 pi. The sine is negative root 2 over 2. The cosine is positive root 2 over 2 because in the fourth quadrant, the y is negative, the x is positive. And so you have something divided by itself is going to be 1 with the negative sign. So the tangent of 7 pi over 4 is negative 1. All right, any questions before we go again to a class kick?